Sustainability. Yes.
Can everyone hear me? Good evening, everyone. My name is Sunny Sarkar, and I'm a sophomore computer science and engineering major, and I'm the current president of the Bangladeshi Student Association here at UConn. And here's the rest of my board.
Hi, I'm Armada Islam. I'm VP.
I'm Amrit Chaudhary, Community Outreach.
Mohammed Islam, the coordinator.
Riftiniha, Community Outreach.
Shaharia Curtis, Secretary.
Hello, I'm Amit Chowdhury, Packer.
Sohan Aziz, Senior Advisor.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land in which we gather is occupied by the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shakitoki, Golden Hill Pawcatucket, and Nipmuc peoples, who have stewarded this land through the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land, and aspire to uphold their responsibilities and according to their example. Firstly, I would like to thank you all for coming to our first ever climate change discussion event. I would like to thank our chief guest, His Excellency Ambassador Masud Bin Momen, for coming to join us today. I would also like to thank University Provost Dr. Craig Kennedy and Vice President of Global Affairs Dr. Daniel Weiner for also joining us. Additionally, I would like to acknowledge the BSA Executive Committee in helping me plan this event, Dr. Angela Rolla and her staff at the Asian American Cultural Center, Dr. Gulshan Ara and Qazi Bilal from the Nazrul Committee of UConn for their support in bringing the ambassador here tonight, UConn Eco Huskies for their support in advertising and marketing, and Dr. Mehdi Anwar for his support in reaching out to the UConn faculty. The primary goal of this event is to bring awareness to the ongoing growing issue of climate change, as well as facilitate further discussion of the topic, to reach more possible goals and solutions of this global dilemma. We hope that this will ignite a series of talks relating to climate change both here on campus and beyond UConn. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I would like to welcome Dr. Daniel Weiner, the Vice President of Global Affairs, to the stage.
Good evening. Before I read off the script, let me just say how wonderful it is to have these young students here organizing this. It gives us hope. It makes us feel good about the future when we see young people doing these kinds of things. So thank you very much. We really appreciate your leadership. Thank you for joining us tonight for the symposium on the climate crisis a global dilemma. And let me just start by saying, I like the fact that you use the term crisis, because we hear about climate change, and that's accurate. But it really is a crisis. So you've got the right word, because climate change makes you feel like you can be a little bit relaxed about it, whereas crisis suggests we've got to do something now. We're also very delighted to have a special guest with us tonight, His Excellency Ambassador Masud Bin Momen, Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of Bangladesh to the United Nations. Thank you, sir, for making the trip. The Honorable Ambassador and distinguished speakers will shed light on critical issues surrounding the impacts of climate change. We tend to hear about the science, but not always what it means for communities around the world. We know that climate change does severely impact the environment, from rising sea levels to destruction of ecosystems. It also creates environmental refugees, food insecurity, and human rights implications. Let me take this opportunity to caution, however, that while climate change certainly exacerbates poverty, it is usually not the cause. We must be careful to not naturalize poverty and to fall into the trap of environmental determinism. And I say that in a provocative way because hopefully we can have some conversation about that. Because something that concerns me is that climate causes poverty. I would argue no. Climate makes it worse, and in some cases it does cause poverty, but the main causes of poverty are very different. Climate intersects with poverty, so sort of we can get into a naturalized interpretation of poverty, which is very difficult. I worked on a climate project in the 1970s. I wrote my master's thesis on Great Plains drought. And at that time, there were actually people, Reed Bryson and others at the University of Wisconsin, that were arguing that we're going to another little ice age. And Stephen Schneider was just beginning to do his work on greenhouse gases and global warming. So there was a debate. Is it going to be cooler or warmer? And at a break, and I was a student at the time, a famous climatologist named Kenneth Hare pulls me aside. We're having coffee and a cookie. And he says, you know, Dan, he says, everybody's talking about whether it be cooler or warmer, but what they're not getting is heightened variability. And I've thought about that moment. Heightened variability. That's exactly what's happening right now. As the world gets warmer, it gets more variable. With that, I would like to introduce Provost and Executive Vice President Craig Kennedy, who will share more on the university's commitment to sustainability. In addition to being appointed Provost to UConn earlier this year, he is Professor of Educational Psychology and Pediatrics. Before joining UConn, he was Dean of the College of Education at the University of Georgia. Prior to his administrative appointments, he was Professor of Special Education and Pediatrics at Vanderbilt University. He has published more than 150 articles and books related to the biobehavioral analysis of autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. Provost Kennedy.
Thank you, Vice President Weiner, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us this evening. Before I give a few words about UConn's commitment to environmental sustainability, I would like to reiterate Vice President Weiner's sentiment and thank Ambassador Masud Bin Momen for being here tonight. Bangladesh is a nation that has already seen the devastating effects of climate change and will continue to be severely affected in the years to come. We look forward to hearing from the Ambassador about the socio-political effects, how the country is handling them, and plans for their future. The University of Connecticut is proud to be a higher education leader in efforts to educate and combat climate change on a local and global level. A few examples that illustrate our commitment: UConn applied for and was provisionally granted COP observer status. We joined the University Climate Change Coalition, a collaborative model designed to help local communities achieve their climate goals and accelerate the transition toward a low-carbon future. UConn signed on to the Grand Coalition Statement on the Paris Agreement to recognize the United States' contribution to the agreement despite policy decisions in Washington, D.C. The university also works with the state of Connecticut through our Connecticut Institute for Resilience and climate adaptation to increase the resilience and sustainability of vulnerable communities along Connecticut's coast and inland waterways to the growing impact of climate change on the natural, built, and human environment. We rank in the top 10 of cool schools by the Sierra Club, for our reputation for environmental stewardship and sustainability, and for the past 7 years, a top 10 university according to the University of Indonesia's Green Metric World University Ratings for Sustainability Development. Moreover, as part of the 2020 Climate Action Plan, UConn recently debuted a new undergraduate classroom and service learning opportunity called Climate Corps, which is a collaboration of the university's environmental studies, environmental science, and environmental engineering programs. The Connecticut Sea Grant Program and the UConn Center for Land Use, Education, and Research. The program promotes independent research and fieldwork to affect local policy changes regarding climate change. Thank you very much for your time, and I will turn it over to Vice President Momen.
Thank you, Provost Kennedy. We are certainly very proud of the leadership we have in the world in this campus. We have a lot of world-class faculty doing work on sustainability and a lot of students very committed to it. I would like to introduce our keynote speaker and honored guest, His Excellency Ambassador Masud Bin Momen, Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of Bangladesh to the United Nations. Sir, it's a real honor to have you here. You're not going to get away that easy. Thank you for making the trip. It really is an honor to be here and to meet you. Prior to his appointment as Bangladesh's permanent representative to the UN in November 2015, Ambassador Momen served as Bangladesh's ambassador to Japan and Italy, and as permanent representative to the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, the World Food Program, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So you can see he has a lot of expertise in the topic. Prior to that, he served as the Director General for Bangladesh's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responsible for matters related to South Asia, including the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. The permanent mission of Bangladesh started functioning in 1974, when Bangladesh became a member of the United Nations. The mission actively participates in the plenary and almost all committees of the General Assembly. Bangladesh is now a member of the United Nations Economic and Social Council and is substantively engaged in the UN Charter body. The Bangladesh mission has been contributing substantially to the present debates of climate change, sustainable development, migration, and development. And if you know a little bit about the geography of Bangladesh, you know the reason why. As the chair of the 9th Global Forum on Migration and Development, the ambassador and the Bangladesh mission endeavor to mobilize all the member states of the United Nations, civil society, and other stakeholders to work for a safe, orderly, and regular migration through strengthening the rights of migrants. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Masud Bin Momen.
Thank you, Vice President, for the introduction. Thank you, Vice President.
Turn the system off. He's trying to preserve energy. But 20 minutes too quick.
that better? Here we go. This
Thank you. President and Executive Vice President, Mr. Greg H. Kennedy, Vice President for Global Affairs, Mr. Daniel Weiner, Ms. Angela Rolla, Founding Director of Asian American Cultural Center, distinguished panelists, my dear students from Bangladesh Student Association and their collaborators, the Yukon Huskies, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to you all. At the beginning, I would like to thank Bangladesh Student Association at Yukon and the Asian American Cultural Center for inviting me to this symposium and giving me the opportunity to have a conversation with our future leaders on climate change, the most defining challenge of this century. This will have various implications for the lives of our future generations. Your minds are fresh, full of constructive thoughts and open to new ideas. What can be a better place than this to discuss the crucial challenge of climate change, and that has been thwarting our aspiration for sustainable development. We have only one planet to live, and we have damaged its environment by our greed and mindless acts and unsustainable production and consumption patterns. Climate change is the reflection and consequence of those acts. I'm sure you all agree with me on that. Population growth, rapid urbanization, food and water insecurity, massive displacement, and forced migration, all these keep posing great challenges to the countries and communities across the globe. However, perhaps none of these is incomparable to climate change, which is simply the biggest threat that the mankind has so far faced with. Erratic weather behavior is affecting our food production. The more our resources are getting limited, the greater the crisis it unleashes. In 2016, 24 million people were displaced due to climate change-induced natural disasters in 118 countries and territories. This figure is scary, as this is 3 times higher than the people displaced due to conflicts. The mass movement of refugees is leading to tensions in our societies. It is putting a heavy toll on our jobs, business, property, as well as sustainability of our economy and development. Hence, climate change is both a threat and the multiplier of many other threats, like poverty, pollution, uprooted people, conflicts, whatnot. Evidently, climate change has the ability to become a great security concern as well. However, does everyone share these concerns over climate change? Is there global consensus on the disastrous impacts of climate change? Unfortunately, not. There is a dilemma, indeed, over climate change and its existence and the severity of its impacts. Why? Are there not enough evidences to back the claim that the climate of the planet is not in a good shape? Scientists have proved that climate change is being driven by human actions. Science paints a grim picture. According to the World Meteorological Organization, the past 2 decades included 18 of the warmest years since 1850, when records began. 2018 is also going to be the 4th hottest. So, global warming is at its highest level. Sea level is rising, our oceans are increasingly getting polluted, glaciers are melting, rivers are getting dry, natural disasters are creating havocs in every corner of the world. Each of these is threatening our lives, livelihood, and our existence. Global warming of 2 degrees Celsius, as set out in the Paris Agreement, is projected to result in a greater reduction in global crop yields and nutrition. This is owing to the combined effects of changes in temperature, precipitation, and changes in extreme weather events and in CO2 concentrations. Climate change can exacerbate malnutrition, reducing nutrient availability and quality of food products. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, released in October this year, emphasizes that climate change influences food and nutritional security through its effects on food availability and quality, access, as well as distribution. This report also highlights that while global warming of 2 degrees Celsius is very likely to decrease agricultural yield, the consequences could be reduced substantially at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Different regions across the world, including the United States, have been witnessing frequent cyclones, monsoon floods, droughts, wildfires of great magnitude. And it is the poor, vulnerable and marginalized peoples and countries who are the worst victims of climate change, despite being insignificant emitters of greenhouse gases. Emissions of GHG by climate vulnerable countries like Bangladesh are no way even comparable with that of the large economies. Per capita CO2 emission of the vulnerable developing countries is only 0.2%. They are disproportionately exposed to the effects of environmental degradation, natural hazards caused by climate change. Because of the limited adaptation and mitigation capacities, their agriculture, ecosystems, health and physical infrastructure are likely to be seriously affected. So the cost of climate change is too high. However, the cost of inaction is even higher. We simply cannot afford to be the passive bystanders only. In 2015, the international community came together to demonstrate their moral obligation to do something about this menace and gave their nations a vision of peaceful, livable, healthy planet in the form of the groundbreaking Paris Agreement. Our leaders made a pledge to limit global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. It is far from what is required to stem global warming, yet it reflected our united resolve to combat climate change. It brought us closer to a safer climate trajectory and created an ambitious path forward for decades to come. 181 countries have become parties to the agreement, representing more than 55% of GHG emission. It's really encouraging and gives us reason to hope for a sustainable planet. The transformative 2030 agenda and the SDGs also rightly identified climate change as an obstruction to sustainable development. Its success in bringing social progress and economic prosperity will considerably hinge upon how effectively we have faced climate change and implemented the Paris Agreement. As we are talking about global dilemma, I should also mention that the pull-out of one of the largest emitters of the world was really a major setback for all our efforts. That was a clear testimony of global dilemma over climate change. That was also a great denial of the warnings that we have been receiving from the scientists, a great dent in our collective resolve to fight back climate change. Nevertheless, we have not lost hope. The Paris Agreement has been the biggest push for integrating climate actions into our national development plans. Governments, cities, regions, all are setting their own ambitious targets. It has inspired businesses to change their mindset and invest in renewable energy. It has brought all stakeholders, including private sector, think tanks, media, civil society, and our younger generation of students, together to work vigorously to save their planet. The dilemma comes from a grave misperception that our actions to combat climate change and reduce our dependency on the fossil fuel would badly affect our economy. It has so happened because some leaders have portrayed climate change only as a challenge and lost sight of the fact that it could provide us opportunities as well. The world is moving towards investing in renewables. 90% of power generation in Europe comes from the renewable energy sources. The rest of the world is also catching up. People are now increasingly looking at solar power as a prospective source of power. These have the potential to diversify economies, create jobs, and reduce pollution. The International Labour Organization reports that common sense green economy policies could create 24 million new jobs globally by 2030. The Secretary General of the United Nations mentioned in his report that in China and the United States, new renewable energy jobs now outstrip those created in the oil and gas industries. He also referred to the installation of more than 4 million solar home systems in Bangladesh that has created more than 115,000 jobs and saved rural households over $400 million in polluting fuels. More than 130 of the world's largest and most influential businesses plan to power their operations with 100% renewable energy. Exploring the alternative sources of energy has opened the windows for new innovations. Clean energy technologies are being embraced around the globe. Ensuring energy efficiency is now regarded as the mantra of the green economies. Governments and private sector are coming forward to spend more on energy infrastructure. These are only a few transformative actions I have mentioned. there are many other actions being taken that make me believe that the environment-friendly initiatives are simply smart options in the current scenario. Not only the developed countries, the developing countries are also expressing their resolute commitment to reverse the course of climate change. We need not be skeptical. Dear students, ladies and gentlemen, you are aware that Bangladesh is an extremely climate vulnerable country to whom climate change is an existential threat. Allow me to share with you Bangladesh experience briefly. Fifth assessment report, AR5 of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reveals that Bangladesh is among the countries that will be most at risk from extreme events. The Global Climate Risk Index 2016 analyzes to what extent countries have been affected by the impacts of weather-related loss events, storms, floods, heat waves, etc., and ranked Bangladesh at number 6 among the most at-risk countries of the world from extreme events due to climate change. We are losing roughly 2% of our GDP every year due to climate change. That's a considerable portion of our hard-earned developmental gains. The fourth assessment report of the IPCC estimated that by 2050, the rice production in Bangladesh could decline by 8% and wheat by 32% against the base year of 1990. However, our vulnerability to climate change has made us more resolute to face this challenge. Our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is a climate crusader. She was invited to attend the recently held One Planet Summit in Paris because of her commitment to tackle climate change. We are among the first group of countries that signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. We are also a part of several climate coalitions such as Climate Vulnerability Forum and V20. Our commitment to engage in climate conversation is quite evident by these facts. Our Prime Minister reiterated that her government's commitment to the Paris Agreement at the High-Level Leaders Dialogue convened by the Secretary General during the High-Level Week earlier, last September, and said Bangladesh will never exceed the average per capita emission of the developing world. Our commitment to low-carbon, climate-resilient development is firm. We plan to move to carbon budgeting, resilient industrialization. We wish to decarbonize our manufacturing pathways. These are principles which guide all our development plans and actions." Unquote. We will not shy away from implementing our nationally determined contributions put forward before the international community. We are going to complete nationwide climate vulnerability assessment as well as review and update our national climate change strategy and action plan. As part of our commitment to the Paris Agreement, Bangladesh submitted its nationally determined contribution in 2016. At the national level, we have mainstreamed climate actions and disaster management in our national planning and sustainable development strategy. Over 1% of our GDP is being used to tackle climate change. US $450 million has been allocated from our own resources for adaptation and mitigation purposes. To ensure food security for our people, we have been investing in transforming our agriculture and making it more resilient to the impacts of climate change and disasters. Initiatives have been taken to increase tree coverage from 22% to 24% in the next 5 years. A project worth $50 million is being implemented for the conservation of the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Bangladesh has integrated its development programs and efforts to build capacity for combating climate change into a mega project titled Delta Plan 2100. It has been developed in consideration of the local geomorphology and of global climate change impact. Bangladesh is perhaps the only country in the world that has adopted such a long-term development plan spanning 82 years. Considering the country's vulnerability to climate-induced disasters, our government adopted a scientific as well as inclusive approach to disaster risk reductions that included hazard identification and mitigation, community preparedness, and integrated response efforts. Taken together, these initiatives have significantly increased the nation's capacity to respond proactively to disasters. We have invested in innovation also. Our agriculturalists have invented climate-resilient varieties of rice and other crops. Our journey to the space technology has started this year with the launching of our first satellite, which we have named after our father of the nation, Bangabandhu satellite. This will also help us in taking our climate and disaster risk reduction actions to a new height. More importantly, we have put in place strong legal regime for the enforcement of and compliance with environment standards set by the government. My dear students, Before I conclude, I want to leave some thoughts for you to think over it. First, shouldn't we seize the opportunities climate change provides us with? To do so, we need strong leaders. We need greater political will of our leaders across the globe to accelerate transformation to green economy, green technology, and the green planet. However, the young generation can take up this leadership and create awareness and mobilize public opinion against actions that aggravate climate change. Second, there must be adequate, predictable, and sustained finance for supporting the vulnerable developing countries in their climate actions. We have to put resource mobilization for global energy transition on top of our priority list. Climate finance must be scaled up to meet the $100 billion target and then move beyond this floor. The most vulnerable developing countries must have access to climate finance measures such as the Green Climate Forum. There is no alternative to increased public spending as a means to climate finance. However, we must engage private sector philanthropic organizations, UN development system, businesses in this endeavor. Third, technology is the best weapon to combat climate change, be it mitigation or adaptation or resilience building. Most advanced technologies must be made available to the vulnerable developing countries. That is the way to turn our economies green. Fourth, international partnership constitutes the bedrock of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. We need to harness the enormous potential that different partnership mechanisms such as North-South, South-South, and the Triangular Cooperation offer us. Fifth, placing climate challenges on the table of negotiations was the fruit of a long, bumpy journey. The commitments that these international agreements articulated were hard-earned. Hence, there must be constant push for delivery on those commitments. Perhaps this would be one way to ensure climate justice. Climate change is a reality that must not be denied. It is a threat that we have to defeat with courage, vigor, and commitment. Disagreements or dilemma, whatever we call it, should not overwhelm our efforts for positive changes. Let us turn ourselves into change makers and keep this planet livable for generations to come. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Ambassador Momen. Our first guest speaker for tonight, Probal Rashid, unfortunately will be arriving a little bit late. Up next, we have Martha Lerski, a librarian and sculptor. Martha Lerski is completing research study, cultural heritage preservation in the context of climate change, adaptation or relocation, arts, education, and Barbuda.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about the broader context of climate change in low-lying countries, but I would focus on my specialty, which is I'm a librarian and a sculptor, and I'm interested in cultural heritage. And I hope that you will think about how your own interests and special talents can be utilized, harnessed to address this question of climate change. So I'm going to be using my particular areas of interest. I study climate change in Barbuda. Has anyone here heard of Barbuda? Barbuda was in the news in 2017. There was a hurricane, Category 5 hurricane, and I was there 2 weeks before the hurricane hit. I was there studying cultural heritage because we already knew that Barbuda was ground zero. With the rising seas and more hurricanes. I was there running an arts camp and asking people about what they value most in their culture and trying to identify what those elements were. And then the entire island was evacuated 2 weeks later. So why do we even care about preserving cultural heritage when we're talking about disasters? That's not the first thing that comes to mind, but precisely because it's not the first thing that we have to deal with, that we obviously want to deal with saving lives and safety first, but we need to think ahead, and we have to think about what culture is. What is it that we might want to save? Is it monuments? Is it community? Is it the governance structure? Tradition? Arts? Those are questions. I was there in August of 2017, and I really was struck when I was in the store in the sister island of Antigua that they had banned plastic bags. And I was thinking about how we hadn't done that yet in New York City, where I live, or in this country. And I happen to know that Bangladesh banned them in 2002. So we're a little bit behind the game in this country. And then, after I left Barbuda, Hurricane Irma hit. And this is a projection, what that looked like. And that's what happened. And these are photos from Barbuda that I had taken in January of 2017. There are caves, and also, so there's some pre-Columbian art there, and the people still use those caves for ceremonies. And on the right there is the British colonial history. Is that what culture is? The New York Times quoted an Australian Indigenous man in October 19th saying, if you lose your culture, you're nothing. So there's a young man, and he's thinking about that in Australia, and many people are thinking about it. His culture is very tied to the land. So how can we best preserve what we value about the past and about our current culture? And emotional well-being is also tied to how we are integrated in our culture. So that's something, along with other medical well-being, psychological well-being, goes along with having a tie to our culture. When I go back in less than 2 weeks to Barbuda, I'm going to meet with the people I worked with last time, and I'm going to give a survey on what cultural elements are most important. And I'm going to ask, do you feel differently about what is it you value now after that experience? And I'd like this to be a template for discussion for people to think about what it is that they value most about their cultures, because things are going to be changing a lot. We might not be able to keep the things exactly the way they are, but what really are the essential elements? So here, you know, is it some kind of oral storytelling? Is it dance? Is it land customs? And I found that to be very important for Barbuda. Within a week of the hurricane, there was discussion of, by the Prime Minister of the country, of selling off the land to private developers, and Barbudans had a law that they had voted to have a different communal land structure. So at a time when they were very vulnerable, there was construction of a new airport and destruction of turtle breeding grounds, and this is something to consider about what might happen to other vulnerable people, because their sister island shares the same religion, the same ethnicity, and even then, there's, you know, taking advantage of a situation. So I'd like to broaden this a little bit from Barbuda and talk about particularly cities, and because the population, 55% of people live in cities now, and I'd like to focus on 3 cities, New York City, Dhaka, and Amsterdam. If we look at this table, we can see that if we're looking at 1 in 100-year flood, that the Netherlands has a relative exposure of 53% of its population. So out of the 10 most exposed countries, that's pretty significant. That translates to 8.4 million. Bangladesh, for that type of a flood, 1 in 100-year flood, has a relative exposure of 1.1% of the population. The United States is not on this list, so that might be one reason why the United States really isn't coming to grips with this. Nevertheless, the United States is contributing to a lot of the carbon increase, so that's a dilemma. Amsterdam in the Netherlands has a long history of dealing with floods, and the water boards are among their oldest political institutions. And now the Netherlands is recognized as one of the most advanced countries dealing with this. They're prepared to deal with a 1 in 10,000 year flood. They also have quite a bit of money to devote to engineering. And even within countries, there are differences in people's ability to adapt. So in September of this year, we had Hurricane Florence. And again, I'm resorting to the New York Times because I'm a librarian and I like certain good sources of information. And I'm quoting a 57-year-old resident who's disabled and unemployed. And he said that he didn't have the money to move out. So that's in the United States. So we have to think of issues of inequality even within countries. Ambassador spoke about how the marginalized and impoverished will be greatly affected by this, by climate change. And the ability to adapt, that will be limited by financial need. World Bank ranking by GDP in 2017, out of 200 countries, the United States ranked number 1, Bangladesh 43. So Bangladesh, when I was growing up, wasn't ranked that highly. Bangladesh has really, made a lot of economic strides. But doesn't have the kind of money to devote to this kind of engineering that we see in the Netherlands. storm surge barrier. The water flows back into the North Sea. So what are some ways that you can protect against rising seas? New York City is one of the most advanced cities in this country. And in 2019, there's a plan to put in protection along the southern, the part of around Wall Street and up to 42nd Street on the east and eventually to 57th Street. So it's going to make a difference. There are going to be some barriers, but they haven't opted for the major storm surge barrier in the Netherlands, partly because they don't want to divert the water to New Jersey. That wouldn't really be fair. In the Netherlands, I talked about different levels of protection for rising seas, and the red here shows you the area that's protected for 1 in 10,000 year flood, and in that is The Hague, Amsterdam, and all those Rembrandts and Van Gogh paintings. So having money is not necessarily correspond to good policy. In 2017, the U.S. pulled out of the climate accord. And in 2012, the North Carolina legislature decided to have a law to not to consider the scientific models about rising seas. So coastal development boomed, and we just recently saw what happened. It reminds me of when I took a group of students to Malawi this summer, and one student said she could get a waiver for the, we were actually traveling through a country that you needed yellow fever vaccination, and she said she could get a waiver. And I said a mosquito doesn't understand a waiver. So I think we need to start thinking a little more realistically. And beyond the hurricanes, there are subtle changes that are taking place. We'll talk about mosquitoes. I like to look at this Climate Central. You can look it up on the web, and you can put in a city. I thought Seattle's a really big developing city in this country, and I wanted to see the disease danger days related to disease transmission by mosquitoes related to the weather change. And you can see from 1970 to 2017, there's an increase. And you can type in different cities, you can look at that. Health is going to be greatly affected by climate change, and the Journal of the American Medical Association said in 2014 that climate change is going to present the kind of challenges that we experienced in the early 20th century, the same, equivalent to the ones we had about pollution, sanitation, clean water. I pulled this off the web, and I'm a librarian. I love it when I can find information without having to go even into something I have to pay for. So I looked up Bangladesh, and I was able to pull up all kinds of statistics. So this information is being made publicly available, and there is this research going on to find out at the household level, even if this indicates that the vulnerabilities haven't been eliminated, it's a start. This is research. So Dhaka and Newark regions are among the top 10 cities in the categories of vulnerability to wind damage and to the most exposed population. I already talked about, and the ambassador spoke about, the improvements in Bangladesh. So what's going to happen with that? This shows us that by 2070, it's predicted that most of those cities that are going to be, the assets are going to be greatly at risk are Asian cities. The Dhaka is number 2 here, and Miami is the only American city there on that. So with all the gains in the economy, that could be wiped out, and I don't know if those gains can go towards creating storm surge barriers. Nicholas Stern, the economist, in 2015 noted that it's possible, very possible, that we could have a 4 centigrade increase in temperature. And we haven't seen that on this planet for tens of millions of years. So what does that look like for Dhaka? I again went into a great resource, Climate Central, and I put in for 2 degrees rise on the left there, and what would happen to Dhaka at 4 degrees? So where would those people move? Where would they move? In my studies, I look at some traditional ways of dealing with these changes. The banning of plastic bags and using some traditional forms of jute sisal bags. And in Bangladesh, I'm hoping to see maybe some of this in the photographer's work about the temporary structures, the chars. I haven't visited Bangladesh, but it's fascinating to me that many people do move around frequently. And there's a modern design called the Dhaka block, which you can disassemble and move around different places. So that's so that's something specific to the culture. This I found in the Guardian newspaper this week about the Hondurans moving north to the border here. And climate change is noted as an unseen driver in the migrant caravan. That's something we need to really seriously think of. There's a lot of tension about migration, and that's another element that we've not been thinking about. So what are some of the non-traditional ways that people have dealt with changes in climate? We need to tap into that. So we already mentioned mangrove forests. I have a bibliography for anyone who's interested of different articles and books, and there are some articles there about some traditional methods that have been used. I already mentioned New York City as under Bloomberg in particular, very good governance with regard to planning for climate change. And so what are some of the other things that can be done? Carbon taxes, building codes. In this country we have a preference, a tax preference for SUVs. That's something that can be done, and that's something that you as students can also voice your opinions politically. So that's New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and in Louisiana, the Army Corps of Engineers redirected the Mississippi away from some costly developments. But when you do that, when you direct a river away from its natural flow, what happens when it overflows? New Orleans is in really great danger. So that's the oldest city in the Netherlands. It's taken a different course. They've decided to let the river flow in its natural way, and that's more sustainable. So the majority of people are likely to be, those who are displaced are likely to be displaced within their own country. So what kind of planning for that? In Dhaka, 8 million Bangladeshis are expected to be permanently displaced by 2050. So where does local knowledge and culture come in? It provides alternatives to what we've not been doing very well. And also gets us to think maybe of some other perspectives other than immediate financial gain. What are the long-term perspectives that maybe our cultures would consider? In Barbuda, they've been selling sand for years because they're a poor country. But what happens when you sell sand? You erode your land, and also it affects the small quantity of drinking water they have. Mangrove here in Barbuda, I already mentioned that the developers were ready to jump in. What about, why put in golf courses that require fresh water when there's not enough fresh water for drinking? And I went to a tribal conference of Southwestern tribes in San Diego last September, and it was really revealing. The woman with her back to us is an archaeologist, and she was explaining in the archaeological time frame, the water that she was looking at was where there used to be land. So how did people adapt to climate change? Well, the native people in this country are on reservations, so they can't move. At that same conference, they gathered scientists together. The scientists wanted to learn from the native peoples, and the native peoples wanted to hear about what the scientists were thinking could be done. So that was a really good collaboration there. There was a statistics professor from the Scripps Institute, and he said that the data points from traditional knowledge really help the scientists to understand what's happening, what has happened in the past. And there's also an initiative in Africa to have open access repositories of traditional knowledge so that we can, all have access to this information. So how are you going to use your own talents? I'm a librarian and a sculptor, so this is what I can do. You as students have so many different ways that you can make a difference. So is this an opportunity to come together? Are we going to focus on the negatives? And I looked a little bit, what is the funding for this event? And I looked to this poet. And in the tender stalk of a lotus, some find the thorn, others the flower. So this may be an opportunity for us to unite, to solve this problem, or at least to make it a little bit less traumatic. And I'm a sculptor, so this particular piece was composed out of one piece of marble that a friend of mine was throwing away because it cracked and he couldn't make what he wanted out of it. So I thought, why not create a dialogue, and I call it the dialogue of the shattered. So I hope that we can not give up on this and we can create something really uniting. And if you have questions for me, I'd be happy to hear from you. And also you can contact me at Lehman College, where I'm a librarian. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. I would like to introduce our next guest speaker tonight, Ashley Toombs. Ashley is the External Affairs Manager of BRAC USA and works hand in hand with BRAC leadership and manages a portfolio of grants for international programs in the area of human rights, legal empowerment, property rights, and climate change.
thank you for making it and for sticking around right now. I know for me it's like starting to get late at night, but I think for students it's like the mid-afternoon maybe for all of you who stay up so late. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy for the invitation. And so before beginning, I want to thank the Bangladeshi Student Association, the university, all the students who are here, the leadership, our ambassador, and my fellow panelists for having me. As Sunny said, my name is Ashley Toombs. I'm the Director of External Affairs for BRAC USA, which is the U.S. affiliate of the organization BRAC. And I've been fortunate enough in the last 3 years to travel to Bangladesh 8 times, and my last 2 trips in January and March of this year actually traveled to Cox's Bazar, to the Rohingya camps. So I'd love it if before I begin diving into the slides and my content, could try to wake some of you up and see it's easy. So if you raise your hand and let me know if you had, those of you raise your hand if you've heard of BRAC before this evening or before learning about this event. Yeah, that's what I imagined. It wouldn't be a lot of you, unfortunately. So hopefully you'll all raise your hand after today, unless you sleep through my presentation. And it's helpful for me to know who's aware of our work before I'm talking. So in addition to coordinating closely in my role with my colleagues in our New York office, I also work closely with colleagues in our operational countries, particularly, as Sunny mentioned, in the areas of human rights, legal empowerment, and climate change adaptation. And I think the last area is the reason why I was the one invited to speak before all of you tonight. And so when the Bangladeshi Student Association first approached BRAC USA this summer about this opportunity, Sunny and I discussed different areas of our work that we might be able to talk about. And I thought it would be helpful to spend some time talking about BRAC's response to the Rohingya humanitarian crisis, particularly our environmental related efforts with this population. And so last participatory question, before I introduce BRAC to all of you, could those of you who have heard of the Rohingya humanitarian situation before tonight raise your hand? Okay, so that's interesting, a lot more of you. Wonderful, thank you. So BRAC was founded in Bangladesh in the early 1970s following the country's independence and originated in the northeastern part of the country, an area called Sylhet. Our founder, Sir Fazli Hassan Abed, who's from Sylhet, had been living in London and was an accountant for Shell Oil Company. Like many people after the country's independence, he went home to see the situation, but unlike most other people, given the devastation from the war and a series of natural disasters, he then went back to London, he sold his flat, and used the proceeds to begin BRAC with an innovative team of colleagues and, of course, with the communities he was working with. From there, the organization expanded regionally, then nationally, and eventually went international to its first country of operations outside of Bangladesh in 2001 to Afghanistan. And as you can see on this map, currently we are operating in 11 total countries between Asia and Africa, and are the only organization in the world of our size and impact that was founded and is still headquartered in Bangladesh and in the developing world. And I think that's something that all of us at BRAC and BRAC USA are really proud of. That when we're talking to people in the United States, it's important for us to always say, you know, we answer to Bangladesh. Every decision we make, ultimately, whether it's BRAC in Uganda, BRAC in Liberia, BRAC in Myanmar, it's answering to our head office in Bangladesh. So BRAC's overarching mission is poverty alleviation, and the organization goes about it in a unique way as compared to a lot of other nonprofits, and that is very business-minded. So year to year, the organization reaches about 120 million people through a series of holistic, multifaceted interventions, and has about a $1.1 billion annual operating budget across all of its entities. BRAC also runs about 15 income-generating social enterprises, in addition to a number of other related investments, including a publicly traded bank, a mobile money platform, whose revenue are used to fund a portion of the social programs which are otherwise dependent on large grants, kind of like a university. The portion of our work which is self-funded by BRAC enterprises will vary from country to country, with the largest being in Bangladesh. So BRAC had actually been operating in Cox's Bazar for about 35 years in health, water sanitation and hygiene, tuberculosis and malaria prevention, education, women's empowerment, legal education, and financial inclusion at the time of the August 2017 influx of Rohingya into Cox's Bazar. For those of you who aren't aware, Cox's Bazar is a hilly region, one of two in what is otherwise a mostly flat country, much of which was protected previously as national forests prior to this situation. For those of you who aren't aware of the size of this situation, approximately 700,000 Rohingya entered Bangladesh from Myanmar during what is the US or Connecticut's late summer to early winter of last year. There were already approximately 250 to 300,000 Rohingya living in the Cox's Bazar area, so now we're looking at a total of about 1 million Rohingya living in Bangladesh today. For perspective, there are around 500,000 Bangladeshi host community members who live in the same area, so now we have double the population of Rohingya in an area with about 500,000 Bangladeshis. I share this because it's important to remember that in addition to the Rohingya being affected by their current situation, of course, the lives of the host community members have also changed significantly in the past year, in addition to the massive toll that this movement of humanity has taken on the environment. BRAC is currently the largest civil society responder in the camps, with about 3,000 people responding in 9 sector areas. And since the beginning of our response efforts, BRAC has been working under the direction of the Bangladeshi government and closely with UN agencies and other organizations to holistically support the situation. So this slide lists out some of the sectors in which BRAC and other agencies are responding. Sometimes BRAC is the lead organization, and other times we're under the direction of other agencies, and always with the goal of meeting the diverse needs of the communities in top of mind. So shelter and non-food items, BRAC is providing life-saving emergency shelters and non-food items to all the new refugees, households affected by natural disasters, and others in need. For health and nutrition, we're working in this area by running vaccination campaigns, conducting community health outreach, malnutrition prevention and treatment programs, working closely with pregnant and breastfeeding women, and addressing disease outbreaks. For protection and child protection, as you can imagine, with such a large influx of people, there's a significant amount of vulnerability, and BRAC aims to support communities to protect themselves by training community outreach members and running community groups, community centers, and information points, particularly focused on sexual and gender-based violence as well as child protection. BRAC aims to ensure quality education through infrastructure and curriculum development in Burmese and English and in child-friendly spaces. Site management is overseen by the Bangladeshi government among BRAC and other organizations, where roles and responsibilities for camp managers and service providers are clearly defined and agreed upon. And in the communication for development, BRAC has coordinated over 900 community mobilization volunteers who promote life-saving messages on health, hygiene, nutrition, sanitation, and protection. Given that I'll have a deeper focus on environmental efforts, I'll save discussing the water, sanitation, hygiene, and ag and environment for the next slides. So as I mentioned earlier, Cox's Bazar, also in addition to having been a hilly area with national forests, it's also one of the most flood-prone regions of Bangladesh. Therefore, emergency preparedness for the cyclone and monsoon seasons that they face every year has been one of the highest priorities for BRAC and its partners. As some of you may know, there is a high risk of cyclones in April and May, and flash floods and landslides are common between June and August. The rainy season lasts through November, and the effects on terrain are unpredictable due to the massive population that recently moved there, hill cutting, and the removal of trees and vegetation. So to prepare for these weather and climate-related risks, BRAC has prioritized relocating individuals in vulnerable areas in advance and during the cyclone and monsoon seasons, which are just, as you can imagine, going through November, just starting to end. The Bangladeshi government and other organizations are continuously digging out drainage, ditches, installing culverts, and constructing bridges, stairs, and retaining walls. Shelter and programmatic upgrades are ongoing, installing sandbags for slope protection, fortifying structures through tie-down kits, bamboo strengthening and repairs, improving roofing, building structures on stilts to accommodate for potential flooding, and planting fast-growing vegetables outside of homes to both diversify diets and help reduce the potential for erosion. So we have to remember in this situation, people didn't enter the country and move into houses, right? They moved into structures that are made of bamboo. They're on the ground, an area that was previously covered in trees just a few months ago. So this is the context of the situation we're looking at. And under water, sanitation, and hygiene, or WASH, BRAC is providing access to clean and safe water for drinking and hygiene purposes, ensuring that latrines meet accepted WASH standards, and promoting overall improvement of personal hygiene through the use of latrines, hand washing areas, and gender-specific bathing areas. BRAC is also regularly desludging, that's the WASH term for cleaning up latrines, or decommissioning latrines and ensuring water quality control at 2 well sites. And not just the ones that we built. This effort is across, it's multi-sectoral, and it's with a lot of organizations and hand in hand with the government. So BRAC is also in the process of installing 10 biogas plants to ensure the recycling and safe disposal of human waste. So under each plant, there are 11 latrines which benefit about 220 people daily. These help to reduce pollution, produce organic fertilizer, and reduce dependence on the forest for firewood. We've also built communal kitchens in some of the camps to both provide improved stoves that require less fuel than more makeshift cooking methods, and to create more spaces for families to gather. For many women in particular, these communal spaces provide a space to gather, talk, and enjoy a feeling of normalcy and community in what otherwise has been a completely difficult situation for them, where they're not necessarily close by to their family and their former neighbors. Other activities include planting trees, providing vegetable seeds and technical knowledge, crop demonstration plots in the host community, and inputs for high-yield crops, nutri-gardens, and landslide protection. So as you can imagine, there have been massive efforts on the part of the Bangladeshi government, BRAC, and other organizations to support the Rohingya and the host communities, particularly around environmental and climate issues, which are disproportionately affecting this area of Bangladesh even more than the rest of the country prior to this influx of a new population. So looking forward, all of these entities are taking into consideration the deep complexity of the situation and are continuing to seek creative opportunities to promote the well-being of the populations and the environment in the areas of climate preparedness, and are particularly focused on resiliency, adaptation, and mitigation, which was just a lot in the last presentation. So I'll thank you now. I'll stop now. Thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to hearing your feedback and your questions.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Until our next speaker arrives, we will just initiate the Q&A. So does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the effects of climate change on refugees and Indigenous people, especially because things like that are happening here if you're thinking about things like the Dakota pipelines.
Can you hear me? So there, you can talk about this conference in San Diego, and there were representatives from tribes around the Southwest, and they're dealing with fires, they're dealing with flooding, they're dealing with the same things that you've been hearing about in the news, but there's with the indigenous peoples, they don't necessarily have resources, and they're not able to move. One group was trying to figure out a way of taking money from casinos and devoting that to a climate change fund. So that was, with the options that they had, they felt, well, that's one route that we have to be able to have a mitigation fund. That's one example.
This is a great question, and it's a tough question, and I don't think I think we could have had the whole conversation this evening and our whole semester worth of coursework on that. And so I would say, I think what studies have found over and over again is that Indigenous populations tend to be the best stewards of land. So we know that they tend to be the people who most protect the environment for the long term, and not just have effects in the exact area where they live, but have ripple effects all around surrounding areas, downstream, upstream, etc. But often, and unsurprisingly, they're the least politically empowered. So, the presentation earlier looking at Barbuda, there's a natural disaster and there's a land grab that happens. I mean, we see this all over the world. We see this in our own country. And I think to your other layer, the question about refugees, I think looking globally at refugee context, these are people who have often fled for various reasons, whether it be economic, whether it be violence, whether it be, religious persecution. They fled, and they're at the mercy of wherever they end up. So the government, the local populations, etc. And so I would say, and typically, what you find is that these are populations that are fleeing from one difficult situation to another, and into areas that are often disproportionately affected by climate change. And so I think that Indigenous populations or refugee populations, when you sit down and you ask people what they want or what they need, they know. People know what they want and need. Whether or not they're empowered by systems to achieve it is the challenge. Thank you.
Does anyone have any more questions?
First of all, thank you all for coming here to speak to us today. I had a question about whether, since you all mentioned Bangladesh's progressive stance on climate change as opposed to the U.S.'s retrogressive stance on climate change, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and everything. How have NGOs like BRAC convinced the Bangladeshi government to take such a progressive stance? And how can we here as students convince our politicians to do the same?
So I can start. I would say BRAC is an apolitical organization, and so what that means is that we work with all governments, and I would say BRAC is not the one convincing the Bangladeshi government to do this progressive environmental changes. The Bangladeshi government is actually has been ahead. We were talking about that prior to getting up here on the panel, that the Bangladeshi government has been very forward-thinking and very progressive on things like banning the plastic bags. But for those of you who have actually been to Bangladesh, I was saying the use of compressed natural gas is another area where, a city like the capital Dhaka with such a massive population, the fact that you can walk around and breathe fairly well as compared to a lot of other Asian or South Asian countries as a comparison is amazing. And so I would say, alternatively, from just flipping your question around a little bit, I don't think BRAC or other NGOs are telling governments what to do. I think it's best positioned when we're working hand in hand. And so when you have strong ministers and leaders in government, that's the best possible situation for a nonprofit. Because then you have the desire on the part of everyone to improve, whether it be environmental, health, agriculture, whatever the indicators might be. And so what BRAC tries to do is work really closely with the government and the leadership to align our efforts with their positive efforts. And so I'll stop there for now.
When I was in Barbuda before the hurricane, I was able to work closely with the community because there was already a relationship between the Barbuda Archaeological Research Center, which has different universities around the world involved with that, as well as CUNY. So there was a level of trust and a level of collaboration that was already established. So I think that involvement with community and listening to the stakeholders, that's an essential thing. So it's not something telling people how to improve things, it's listening and finding out what's on the ground. So I think that's really important, being involved with the community.
Sure. All the way in the back.
Yeah.
With that.
What was the question? Do you mind passing it down?
Hi, I was wondering, to what extent do you think the climate crisis is a crisis of capitalism?
Great question, tough question.
If capitalism, it depends how one defines capitalism. So is there an element in capitalism that's short-term thinking? In that sense, it is very related. If we're looking at quarterly reports, if that's the kind of mind frame we're in, then we're not thinking about what's going to happen 2 years from now, or what's going to happen for generations in the future. And then what kind of capitalism, what we're seeing right now in this country with taxes, and personally, I don't think it's very long-term thinking. So that's my response.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I think I would agree with everything you just said, and maybe I would just add, I think that's one of the things in my life when I've looked at, prior to BRAC, most of my career was looking at conservation and environmental work in Latin America, and one of the things that I started focusing on was more where's my role in all of this, and how can I empower myself and empower those around me, whether it be my family or my friends or the community that I'm serving. And coming from the United States, coming from a place where materialism, which I think is inherent in your question around capitalism, is hand in hand with the way, you're sort of brought up here, at least in the US. And so I started thinking a lot about my actions and my decisions, which feels pretty hypocritical as I'm drinking out of a bottle of water. I will acknowledge that. And so I would just say, I don't think I'm answering your question, because I think your answer about short-term versus looking at the long-term is probably much better than what I could come up with in this moment. But I think I would sort of, I would say, yeah, I think it does have, I think it very goes hand in hand with climate challenges. But also I would encourage everyone to look at the decisions you can make in your day-to-day life, and the things that you can make, little decisions you can make that are manageable. It's like New Year's resolutions, make manageable decisions, and then try to build it into a long-term sustainable way of living. Because not all of us are going to become politicians and policy influencers.
But some of you may be business students, or you might be entrepreneurs in some way, and the private sector can come up with energy solutions. So there are different variations on capitalism. So if that's the culture here, that is a culture. That's a cultural issue here. So how do we harness that in ways that might help us?
Okay, so kind of bouncing off the question of capitalism, how would you suggest that private sectors overturn the type of resources that we're using? If we're considering our use of oil and gas for our cars, yeah, we have electric cars, but no one makes them, because once they do, oil companies go out of business, and we're thinking about products that are made of petroleum. That takes up a lot of the things that we use day to day. So how do you suggest we go about finding different resources that are more environmentally friendly?
So I can take a stab. I mean, I think we were talking about this also before coming into, and I can't remember if you were in the room when we were, I don't think you were, when we were talking about this, you know, looking at private sector is motivated by profit, and profit often is influenced by technological innovations and, you know, how can we advance technology so that you're making more profit. And so I would say in some ways, the current trends are really encouraging, that there are, whether or not the political environment is enabling is a different question, but the trends we're seeing around energy, for example, which is one of the hugest contributors to climate change, we're seeing a move towards renewable energy. And we were talking about in the room that, you know, even though our politicians and our media are focused on coal, in a lot of ways, actually, the technology and the investments are shifting more towards the renewable sector, which is very exciting and very encouraging because in thinking about Bangladesh, Bangladesh is a country that's been really progressive around this area, but Bangladesh is deeply, being such a low-lying delta country, it's affected by the decisions of the United States, for example, every day. So that would be one thing that I would say is encouraging. And I had something else, but I forgot, so maybe it'll come back to me.
Yeah, I'm just going back to the indigenous people, and I'm just trying to think how coming together, you know, we're stronger as a unit, a unified force. And I was talking to members of the tribes, and they were saying how with the Dakota pipeline, you know, the tribes used to be sometimes warring with each other, and here they are all coming together, you know, to protest. And so maybe that's, you know, that's one way we can work together.
Another question. You can just do it without the microphone if you want.
Yeah, okay, so my question is, I know that renewable energy is an important adaptation strategy, but some forms of renewable energy, like hydropower, are not definitely have important social consequences, especially for indigenous people. So when we talk about transitioning towards renewable energy, is hydropower and, you know, many of the implications that we're aware of in terms of displacement, in terms of, you know, the way that, you know, hydropower projects are used by governments to really repress people. Are these, you know, being taken into account when, you know, renewable projects are being implemented, or do you feel like there's just, you know, we've got to implement whatever renewable energy we can for the sake of it? Do you think that there's, like, do you think there are enough, do you think the social impacts are studied enough, or do you think it's very rushed?
Sorry to interrupt, but we are running short on time. If you do have any remaining questions, there is a reception afterwards where you can ask each of the speakers individually or all together. What I need to do before we finish is show, so Mr. Rashid is running late, but we will just continue and show his video.
And then we can definitely try to talk about your question.
Yes.
If not, in the reception.
Bangladesh lies on a deltaic plain with 5 major river systems: the Jamuna Brahmaputra, the Padma Ganges, the Surma Meghna, the Padma Meghna, and the Karnafuli. It is known worldwide to have 6 seasons, but it has become difficult to identify all of them. With the hot summer and monsoon season dominating most of the year of the country, Bangladesh is one of the countries most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. The regular and severe natural hazards that the country already suffers from, tropical cyclones, river erosion, flood, landslides, and drought, are all set to increase in intensity and frequency as a result of climate change. The impacts of sea level rise are gradual but unstoppable. By the 2080s, it is predictable that a 65 centimeter sea level rise will have caused 40% of productive land to be lost in southern Bangladesh. Already about 20 million people in coastal areas are affected by salinity in drinking water.
এই বছরে 2 কিলোমিটারের উপরে গেছে এই বনটা। গতবারের আগের বার আবার 2-3 কিলোমিটার গেছে। এই বনটা 2 বছরের 5 কিলোমিটারের মতো মাংস।
Due to sea level rising resulting from climate change, limited sweetwater sources of the coastal areas have widely been contaminated with saline water. Some regions are always waterlogged. There is water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. The hardest times are the summers and winters when rainfall is minimum. Those who preserve some rainwater from the previous year's sources are lucky. Otherwise, most of the people have to travel long distances to get pure drinking water. Thousands of men and women go into the Sundarbans forest in southern Bangladesh every day to gather honey, collect firewood or catch fish, and putting themselves at great risk for a tiger attack. In almost every village there is a woman or man. Commonly the women are referred to as a Bag Vidova, that is, tiger widow, whose spouse has been a victim of a tiger attack. Floods force thousands of animals to move higher ground every year. The impact of fast-flowing water, particularly on small or burrowing animals, would have been more serious, usually resulting in death. Food and habitat shortages also present longer-term impacts on those that survived, and certain endangered species can be at risk after flooding events. City's homeless people are environmental migrants. They arrive in Dhaka with the hope of a better future. Every day, some 2,000 people settle in the Bangladeshi capital. It's nothing new. For generations, the city has been a magnet for men and women escaping rural poverty. But now there's another driver that experts say has accelerated the race to the capital, the Earth's changing climate, which has already made life extremely difficult.
Mr. Rashid is still on his way here. He will be here for the reception, so if you have any questions on the movie or his ideas in general, feel free to ask him, but for now, he will give his presentation over the phone.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Good evening, everyone. First, I apologize for that. I'm still on my way to the event. Sorry, I'm really sorry. My name is Probal Rashid. I am a documentary photographer based in Bangladesh, currently moved in Washington, D.C. I have been documenting the impact of climate change in my country over the past few years. Bangladesh is one of the countries most vulnerable to the effect of climate change. The regular and severe natural hazards that the country already suffers from tropical cyclone, river erosion, flood, landslide, drought, and all are set to the increase in intensity as a result of climate change. I think you already saw my video. I think my work is here not only to describe the present problems in Bangladesh, but also to warn us of the future problems before it's too late. Climate change is not a national issue, rather a worldwide issue, and will impact the general population and the planet. So let us not wait for the world and raise our voice to make an impact. So I think I'm on my way almost 10 minutes arrive at the event. So I apologize again. Sorry, I'm really sorry that I couldn't arrive till 8 p.m. My flight was my flight depart time was 12:20, but and it was on time. All passengers were on board. Suddenly, a pilot noticed that there was a problem. That's when I did.
So I was realizing as I watched the video that one of the things I forgot to mention in my presentation with where Cox's Bazar is with the rolling hills, that's actually there was a lot of wildlife in that area that was also displaced with the situation, and seeing the image of the elephant reminded me that one of the big challenges is that was an area with a lot of forest elephants who had natural corridors that, for most of you who understand elephants, they have decades and decades of knowledge that are in their herds. And there's now an issue around wildlife protection, and particularly elephants tend to be pacifist creatures, but they can be quite violent and destructive. And now as they're trying to return to their natural corridors, they're encountering the camps. And it's creating a pretty massive wildlife and human conflict that I don't quite think anyone knows what to do with yet. And maybe we can answer the hydropower conversation question since we have a minute or two.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't really speak to that about how that would be managed. Other than that, a lot of issues need to be addressed regionally, and the way that rivers are flowing and not flowing. Some rivers come from other countries, and the sources are in other countries, and so we really need to not only think about how specific technologies might be not working in the best ways, alternate technologies, but we need to think on a bigger scale, because these situations, these rivers, these oceans are beyond boundaries. And when I was reading about different legal approaches to managing displacement, there seems to be a lot of agreement that these issues need to be addressed on a regional basis, that we can't have strict conventions about how this would happen. There are people here who could address this more knowledgeably, but that just raised that issue for me.
Yeah, and I would say to the question about hydropower specifically as a renewable, to be totally honest, I have my sort of professional opinion, which is going to be based somewhat on the organization where I'm working and where we stand. And then, of course, I have my personal opinions and the way I feel personally about these things. And so I think we know, that hydropower has these dual, before when these massive, massive dams are being considered, I would say professionally that entities like governments and the World Bank and the IMF are improving the standards with which they're looking at the social effects, and certainly they're looking at the economic and the energy effects. I would say personally, we have a long, long way to go. That's my personal opinion. I think we're not anywhere near where we should be, and to the point you were just making, I think what we often forget, and it's not necessarily in the best interest of governments who are making decisions around dams. Dams don't just affect the local area where they're being put, but they affect they affect countries downstream. And so with the South Asian context in mind, I used to work for the Nature Conservancy, and a former colleague shared with me that Nature Conservancy was in conversations with the Indian government for years around water, particularly around hydro projects. And they were finally invited after about 5 years to meet with the government officials, and then when they sat down and they went with a whole team of scientists and said, let's look at your water data, your rivers, your streams, the flow, what would happen, the Indian government absolutely refused to give them any access to that data. So even with an organization that they supposedly trusted, they've been in conversations with for multiple years, at the end of the day, they didn't get any access to the information. And I don't know what happened, but you can imagine if there's being decisions made about water in India, what country is that going to affect deeply? It's going to be Bangladesh, as an example. And so I just share that as a sort of anecdotal example, though, that I've seen in my own experience, and that's why I sort of have these layers, these nuanced layers between how I express things professionally versus how I feel personally that we have a lot of growth to do still.
Okay, it is now almost 8 o'clock, so we will be concluding the discussion. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to come to the reception afterwards in the lounge. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you for the speakers for presenting today, and thank you, Ambassador Masud Bin Momen, for coming. And if you have not signed in, please sign in as well. Right here. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.